Order. Can I welcome everyone to this evidence session for the Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry into serious violence, and welcome the Minister and Mr Greaves to give evidence to us this morning. Just before we begin, Mr Greaves, could you just outline what your role is in terms of on serious violence within the Home Office?
Yes, so I'm Director of Crime at the Home Office, and my responsibilities span crime strategy as a whole, and in particular serious violence, including serious violence strategy, policy on knife crime and gun crime and gangs. I also have responsibility for a broader set of crime types, including acquisitive crime and antisocial behaviour. Thank
you very much. You're both very welcome this morning. Just in the last few days, there's been an 18-year-old stabbed to death in Southwark and a 15-year-old stabbed to death in Hackney. So we have more families being devastated. I know that this is obviously an issue, Minister, that you have been working on, but what we want to probe is what is happening and what actions the Home Office is taking to address this awful crime of children dying on our streets. So can you tell me what targets have you set for this time next year?
Well, first of all, may I thank the committee for scrutinising this really important part of not just Home Office policy, but the impact it has on our communities. And indeed, I'm sorry to have to inform the committee, but there's been fatalities. We understand we've just received reports in Birmingham, which rather underlines the point that this isn't just about London, it's across the country. On the subject of targets, this is something that we debate at great length in the Home Office, and we don't have a target on decreasing homicides for the reason that wherever we set that target, I don't feel I could look a mother or a father who has lost a beloved, cherished child and say and have a target imposed, and if that child is within that target, I wouldn't want anyone to think that that is somehow something that we accept or we're sanguine about. And so we don't want, of course, we do not want any child or any person to be murdered in our country. And so we look at other measures to determine the success or the movement that our policies are making. But of course, one murder is too many.
What are those measures or objectives?
Well, we have if we take a step back, the serious violence strategy, which we launched in April last year, was the culmination of very intensive work and research by not just Home Office officials, but asking experts, policing colleagues, and so on, as to what was happening on our streets and what people think the drivers are and what the evidence suggests the drivers are. And there are a number of different measures that different police forces use, because one thing that's very clear from not just serious violence task force meetings, not just the engagement events that we hold across the country, but also in meetings with the chief constables that the Home Secretary has regularly, is that there are different solutions to homicides across the country. What may work in London may not work in another part of the country. And so
but what objectives have you set nationally as part of the strategy to be met by this time next year?
So the objective is to reduce homicide. Of course, that's the objective of every police officer.
So it's simply a reduction. Do you have any
other
I would like
objectives
in terms of any other particular things that you want to measure along the way, any particular things that you want to have in place?
To be clear, I want no homicides at all, of course, clearly. But we look at, for example, the Metropolitan Police looks at knife crimes whereby injuries are sustained by under 25s. That's a very powerful measure. And only last week the Commissioner was telling us that, and we are very, very cautious in commenting on these trends, but there seems to be a reduction in that in the streets of London. We look at, for example, the rates of knife crime generally, and that is beginning again very cautiously, is falling in London. We look at gun crime, that nationally it continues to fall.
But just to be clear, do you have any measurable objectives for this time next year? It could be programmes you want to have in place, it could be other things that you want to achieve, or numbers of people you want to have reached with particular things. I'm still really unclear. You just seem to be talking about different amounts of data that individual forces will analyse. What objectives has the Home Office set, or the government as a whole set, around tackling knife crime by this time next year?
I do apologise. With the use of targets, I was interpreting that as the data, if you like. But in terms of the wider objectives, we have set in the strategy, which was a year ago, we have set 61 commitments. And they're very detailed commitments. I'm very happy to provide you with a copy. We have completed 45 of those commitments, and the remaining 16 are works in progress. The Prime Minister, and I should say, by the way, the strategy is a government-wide document. It's not just focused on the Home Office. And so in terms of objectives through those 61 commitments, we have, for example, set up the social media hub that is being piloted in London at the moment to help the Metropolitan Police work with the big tech companies to get some of these images that we know are causing problems with gangs, get those down as quickly as possible. We have already set up the National County Lines Coordination Centre, which helps all of the police forces around the country with the issue of county lines, which is a major factor in violence, particularly outside our larger urban conurbations. That has already seen, in the few months it's been operating, more than 1,000 arrests and more than 1,300 people safeguarded. We have set up the independent review of drugs by Dame Carol Black, because we understand that drugs is a major driver, so that is reporting in the summer. We have also set up the Youth Endowment Fund, which has locked in £200 million to invest in early intervention for young people.
I'm still slightly struggling to see what the actual measurable outcomes are, though. I mean, look, for example, how many children do you assess as being at risk of knife crime?
Well, the evidence that we have of that, and we're mindful of what the Children's Commissioner has reported on this, that she estimates up to 27,000 children are related to gang activity. Dan will be able to help me with some of the discussions we've been having with her as to how she's reached that figure.
And do you have that figure broken down into different areas?
If I may, I'm going to pass to Dan.
So, to the best of my knowledge, that is provided only in the report nationally, but I have to check that for you.
So, does the Home Office have any assessment itself of how many young people are at risk of being involved in knife crime?
I don't have that number to my hand. What we do have in these strategies is a very detailed assessment of the risk and protective factors underlying.
I want to understand the scale of the problem, and I also want to understand if you understand the scale of the problem. So, how many people do you think, how many young people do you think are at risk of being involved in knife crime?
So I think we can say that there are some people who are at particular risk as a result of
how many young people are at particular risk?
Well, I don't have that number. That number will be a function of a whole wide range of factors, including adverse childhood experiences, early misuse of drugs, school attainment, and the overlap between those groups will be difficult to
Of course.
to compile.
I still want to understand whether you have an estimate of it, whether the Home Office maybe you don't. Maybe you don't have an estimate of the number of young people who are at risk of being involved in knife crime across the country. But in which case, if you don't, tell us that you don't.
We tend to look at the causes or the factors that lead to a child either being the victim or the perpetrator of knife crime, and they do vary enormously, as I say, across the country. We know, for example, that domestic abuse is a huge indicator of a child.
I understand that. I'm still just trying to understand whether the Home Office has any grip on the scale of the problem and the scale of the risks that we're dealing with. How many young people have access to an outreach youth worker?
I don't.
Again, I don't have that number at my...
How many young people are involved in any kind of youth diversionary activity after school?
I don't have the numbers of that, because again, those would be figures that local authorities may know, but also charities will hold those figures.
So does that mean that the Home Office has made no attempt to assess the number of young people who are in some way engaged in youth services or youth diversionary activity of some kind?
I wouldn't say we've made no attempt. If you look at the range of charities that we support, for example, two of the charities that were set up by the parents who gave evidence to the committee, that we would not necessarily expect them to feed into us the number of children that they're working with. And so
why
that
not?
we
So
have a range.
why not? Why don't you need to know how many young people are at risk and how many young people you're reaching? Your own strategy rightly talks about early intervention, about youth engagement, about youth diversionary activities, rightly, and you are rightly funding some of those activities. But you seem, as a department, to have no sense of the scale of the problem that you're trying to tackle or the scale of your interventions. I mean, do you even know how many young people your own funded interventions are going to reach?
Can I just come back to the point about risk factors and those at risk? The serious violence strategy itself provides a very detailed analysis of the risk and protective factors and an assessment of those, the numbers of people who fall within those groups and the overlap between those groups. So I'm very happy to commit to come back to you on following discussions with analytical colleagues with an assessment of those at risk. I just also wanted to clarify the split of responsibility between national and local. We clearly have responsibility for setting the overall national strategic framework for for serious violence. We provided a very detailed analysis of the trends and drivers of serious violence, the risk and protective factors, and what we believe works in tackling serious violence. That was very well received by local partners. We've made a number of targeted investments, including in the Early Intervention Youth Fund, the Youth Endowment Fund, and the #KniveFree national campaign to change attitudes and behaviours. Clearly, many of the functions come together locally with police forces, probation services, safeguarding boards, and there are frameworks for local partners to collaborate and bring together locally a shared understanding of just the sorts of problems that you've talked about and to agree joint solutions. And that is why we are consulting on a legislative duty to kind of collaborate and partner on serious violence. So we need to think about the balance between the local and the national. It's really the local responsibility.
I want to come back to local things, of course, but you have talked rightly about a public health approach. Having been a public health minister, when you start with a public health approach, the first thing you do is ask yourself, what is the level of population that is at risk? And what is the scale of the risk that you're dealing with? And then you look at, well, what are the interventions that you've got and how many people are you going to reach with those interventions? And I am just quite baffled where you've got something that is as serious as this. When you have got a 70% increase in knife crime in the last 4 years, when you have got a 93% increase in the number of children attending A&E who have been stabbed in the last 6 years, when you have got a 37% increase in homicide, I am just baffled that you don't have a basic assessment of the number of young people who are at risk and then have an assessment of what your policies are doing to reach those young people.
Well, as I say, at the national level, we set the strategy. I mean, it is. There are differences between policing an area where there may be, particularly with the involvement of gangs, there may be volatility in a way that perhaps there isn't if one's looking at the public health issue of obesity, for example. I think back, there's one particular family I met recently whose son was literally in the wrong place at the wrong time in a postcode war between gangs. Now, that child was, he was killed as a result of knife crime, but given he was a very well-behaved child, attaining great things at school and college, that he would not come onto the police radar as being at risk of knife crime. Do you see that? So there is.
So that's what you might sit there and say to me. It would be perfectly reasonable for you to sit there and say to me, look, we have a series of different measures. Yeah. We have this assessment of the young people who we think might get drawn into carrying a knife. Yeah. That's one group. We might have another assessment of the number of young people who live in areas where knife crime has been escalating, who might be another group and another measure. You don't seem to have any of those measures, those just basic assessments of the scale of the challenge that you are dealing with.
Well, forgive me if we haven't explained this, but for example, the £100 million that was announced in the spring statement to deal with violence, that is being, 3/4 of it has been allotted to the 18 forces that have seen the highest increases in admissions to A&E with knife injuries. So we are assessing, we are using the data to assess where the money should be spent. The remaining third will be spent on the setting up of violence reduction units, which will be bringing together all of the agencies locally who should be sharing data, sharing information to ensure that we're not just targeting the gang leaders, but also targeting the children who are most at risk. So you're absolutely right. There are different measures, and my officials spend a great deal of time looking at those measures to see what's happening on the ground and to see what is being done locally. Because the
biggest challenge to you is not that individual things that you're doing might not be worthwhile. It's that you just have no grip on the scale of the problem. Now, look, this is not just an issue for you, Minister. This is obviously an issue for the Home Secretary. It's an issue for the Prime Minister. But I'm getting nothing from you today that gives me any sense that you've actually got a grip even on the scale of the problem that you're trying to deal with, and therefore that there is any way for us to measure whether your strategy actually matches the scale of the challenge.
Well, we know that there are, for example, around 2,000 county line gangs. That's the most recent estimate from the National Crime Agency. Of course, again, slightly differently from public health issues, where by and large people aren't seeking to conceal their public health issues by and large. By the very nature of criminality, gang leaders don't tend to reveal themselves. They don't tend to reveal their methods of recruiting children. We know about it because we rely on police officers and National Crime Agency picking up intelligence and listening to youth workers and others, finding out information that way. But the criminal underworld is not best. They're not minded to help the police and to help us understand what they're doing and how they're recruiting children, which is an extra obstacle in how we try and find those children who may be affected.
Well, we understand that this is hard, but it's also incredibly serious with the consequences. And it just doesn't sound at the moment that you've even got estimates. At local level, do police or partnerships at local level have an assessment of the scale of the risks or the scale of the problems in their areas? Is it just nationally that you haven't got a grip?
So can I just talk you through kind of the concentration? So I think it is a very significant challenge, and the numbers speak for themselves, but they are quite concentrated. The risks, as you've described, are concentrated in certain groups of cohorts of young people who are at heightened risk. Equally, the risk is quite concentrated geographically. So we've invested £100 million. We'll be investing £100 million in policing, of which £65 million will be in surge policing, 18 forces which cumulatively account for over 80% of the knife crime. If you look at the heat maps within those areas, actually they're quite concentrated. The persistent kind of victimisation is quite concentrated in parts of those places. So that data is used both nationally and locally to make sure that we guide our investment where it has the most impact, and so that we can have some assurance that local forces are targeting their assets on hotspots and working in partnership with a range of public agencies to concentrate efforts both on geographical risk and those individuals at heightened risk.
And to underline
who's responsible? So if you were thinking about knife crime in Birmingham or knife crime in Leeds, who is responsible for making sure that knife crime comes down in those areas?
I think all agencies, and the reason we're consulting on imposing a legal duty on agencies to reduce serious violence, I think all agencies have a responsibility.
And who's responsible for making sure?
Sorry?
Who's responsible for making sure that all of those agencies are working together, or that they're all doing their bit?
The Chief Constable, of course, is responsible for policing, law enforcement activity on the ground. In terms of ensuring who is doing that at local level, at the moment, it can be quite difficult to find out who that is. Community safety. Well, this is precisely why we're consulting on the public duty, and why we're investing in violence reduction units.
Who's in charge of the violence reduction units?
So in London, it is the mayor. In the other areas that have yet to set up violence reduction units, it will be a body which will comprise the police, local authorities and health authorities.
And who's actually in charge of them? So
that would be for local areas to decide. I mean, in West Midlands, the Chief Constable is setting up, is at a very advanced stage of setting up the violence reduction unit. The fact that he's setting up, I would argue, says that he's leading it. But we want to support these units, not just financially, but also giving them and their professionals the comfort of knowing that they can share and should share data.
When will all of those units be in place? When will they all be up and running?
So just to break down the figures, the £100 million overall was 2/3 on surge policing. We've already announced the allocations for that, £35 million for violence reduction units. We are doing the detailed engagement and design work over the course of May, and we will announce allocations we expect in early June. Clearly we need to work very closely with areas to look at the pace of delivery, but as the Minister said, work is already underway in a number of areas. So the Minister spoke about the violence reduction unit in London. There is a violence reduction unit in Birmingham being worked up, which is jointly hosted by the Chief Constable and the Director of Public Health. And in Essex, there's a violence and vulnerability unit. So a lot of work is in place. What we'll be doing is accelerating and industrialising work
but by September, will they all be up and fully running?
I would think that unlikely. I don't want to speculate, but given that the time frame, a lot of them will be, but So
we miss an entire summer season, and in lots of areas you still won't even have a violence reduction unit in place. In the meantime, while these units are being set up, who is responsible in Leeds? Who are you holding responsible? Who do you ring up, Minister, if you're worried that there seems to be a spike in Birmingham or in Leeds or whatever? Who do you ring up and say, come on guys, what's going on? What are you doing? Who's working with who to actually tackle this?
Just to say that we don't leave our engagement for moments of crisis. We have had a forward-leaning programme of engagement across the country with local partnerships. I think, Minister, you're hosting an event with partners in the North East. Tomorrow I hosted an event in East Anglia 2 weeks ago. So our engagement is constant and ongoing to make sure that we share our understanding of the threat, the response, and that we're prompting innovation. However, we do also have regular dialogue at Home Secretary level with the Chief Constables of the forces most affected, and that's a dialogue about discussions about whether they've got the resources and powers, but equally challenge back to them about how they are allocating their resources, how they're using their tactics to really bear down on the problem, because the evidence suggests that focused hotspot policing is what works.
The trouble is, look, we have heard a whole lot of evidence from different people, very senior people with experience in working on a whole series of programmes over the years, including Dame Louise Casey, including Sarah Thornton, Dennis O'Connor, Cressida Dick, including the Children's Commissioner, all effectively saying to us that there isn't enough coordination nationally, there isn't enough strategy, and there also isn't enough local coordination as well. And nothing that you've said provides any reassurance that they're wrong in their assessment. So if the Children's Commissioner says, well, why aren't the safeguarding boards leading on things? At least have somebody, even if it's not the safeguarding board, have somebody lead on it in every area. And the problem is, if all you've got is your violence reduction units that might not be in place even in 6 months' time, that is not very reassuring that you or other organisations across the country have actually got a grip on this serious rising crime that is killing children.
So just to say, we're not working from a zero base in terms of local multi-agency partnerships. I think one of the people who gave evidence talked about there being a duty since the late 90s to work together in tackling crime. And that exists and that is embodied in community safety partnerships. That brings together a wide range of organisations who are responsible for doing the problem profile, making sure the response is adequate. And just before Christmas, I went to see partners in the Safer Essex Partnership to hear about their understanding of the problem and to talk about how they were coming together and brigading around the problem of county lines, blending both the enforcement and the safeguarding response. And I came away reassured both in terms of their understanding and the importance they attach to that, but equally in terms of their development of a capability in the violence and vulnerability unit. So we're not at a zero base. Actually, what we're trying to do is work under the framework of those partnerships and to invest in some targeted capability to accelerate work and bring in a wider set of partners.
The problem is that those frameworks haven't stopped a 93% increase in the number of young people going to hospital because they've been stabbed. Stephen Doughty.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, are there more or fewer youth service places and youth centres today than there were 5 years ago?
There are, because there have been pressures on local authority funding.
So there are fewer. Do you have an idea how many?
I don't, but I can write to you with that.
Do you know how many youth service places have been cut in the last 10 years, for example?
I don't.
You don't? I can tell you. So 600 centres closed between 2012 and 2016, 139,000 places lost. And in London, since the 2011 riots, 100 youth clubs in London closed. That's a halving of youth service provision in London. Do you think that's acceptable?
I think we need to ask ourselves what the youth clubs that you describe, whether they were serving the local communities in the most effective way possible. Some will have been, but there will also have been clubs that closed down because they just weren't attracting young people to use them. I went to see a fantastic youth club up in Derby, the Enthusiasm Trust, and that's an example of a youth club that works really, really well. But the rest of them were fine to get rid of. No, I'm not saying that at all. Please don't put words into my mouth. But there are different ways in which we reach children nowadays. When we look at the work of, say, the St Giles Trust, their youth workers, their former gang members, and their power is the fact of their lived experience. But I'm not just talking about youth centres. I'm not just talking about youth. I'm not just talking about centres here, buildings, Minister. I'm talking about 139,000 places lost between 2012 and 2016. Do you not accept that that's had any impact whatsoever on the levels of youth violence and engagement, not only in crime and disorder more generally, but also particularly in this problem? I wouldn't like to make that leap without the evidence. So if you can show me the evidence, obviously I will consider
I can show you the evidence because knife crime has gone up massively while youth crime, youth places have gone down. We need to be careful on ensuring there's an evidence link on causality. So you don't agree with Lord Coe, then, Minister, who said in April that it blamed the government, said failing to recognise the bloody obvious, that properly funded activities are the most potent social worker in any community, and he said that the government has strangled the life out of youth services in this country, and yet we're surprised. So you don't agree with Lord Coe? Was Lord Coe specifically referencing He was specifically referencing links
violence
between cuts in youth services and rises in knife crime in April.
I'll happily look at that evidence. I'm not for a moment...
So you don't agree with him?
So, I'm saying, if you'll send me the evidence, I will look at the evidence. We have to be really careful here to ensure that the conclusions we draw are based on evidence, which is why we've been very careful with the Timpson review to say, look, the fact of exclusion is a marked, it's a marker but there isn't yet the evidence to show a causality. But it may be. I mean, look,
Minister, I find that quite extraordinary. I mean, I've had young people in my own community in Cardiff, so outside of London, who've been drawn into not only county lines but also knife violence, other criminal activity, and I can directly link that to the pressures that there have been on youth services and cuts in other services and provision. I've had young people stabbed in my own community, and you're sitting here telling me that there's no link and you'd want to see the evidence.
No, I'm not saying. So please.
So there is a link. There is a link between cuts.
Mr. Doughty, I'm saying I will look. I'll happily look at the evidence. This is not a. I want this to stop as much as everyone else. What I've got to be careful is that we do this on evidence. It's precisely why, with the £200 million Youth Endowment Fund, we have specified in the contract that the evaluation of any projects they fund must be absolutely, it's critical to the success of the fund, so that we can spread wider learning further afield. But there's there is work going on with youth work that's perhaps not within the formal structures of local authority.
So what work?
Well, for example, the Premier League KICS programme, that is a really powerful programme that...
and how many young people is that reaching, Minister?
I don't know off the top of my head. I've met them 2 weeks ago. I'm afraid I don't have that figure at the front of my head. You
mentioned the 200 million. I mean, youth services have been cut 768 million since 2010. Youth justice cut by 140 million. So, I mean, even if it was a shift from one type of service to another, that's a complete difference in activity. Can I just ask, who's the Minister for Youth Services, Minister?
It's Nadeem Zahawi.
It's Nadeem Zahawi? Okay, because according to the government...
He's children and young people, so he and I discuss it a lot. Mims Davis has the DCMS lead.
Okay, and when was the last time you met both of them to discuss this issue?
Mims, I met when I met the Premier League, I think 3 weeks ago, forgive me, I don't have my diary to hand, to talk specifically about this. We had the Serious Violence Task Force within the last few weeks as well.
When was the last time you met Nadeem?
I saw him yesterday on the front bench as we were listening to the statement on the Timpson review. Nadeem, I meet regularly to talk about education more widely. And,
do you have a regular setup of meetings? Given the seriousness of this situation, so how often are you meeting your ministers and other departments?
We have the Interministerial Group on Serious Violence, which meets, if not every month, every 5 weeks or so. I meet, in addition to that, my counterparts in the relevant departments.
So not even monthly. Your meeting.
No. It depends. I don't have my diary to hand, as I say. We aim for monthly. There may have been an occasion where we've slipped a week because of ministerial diaries. So it's chaired by the Home Secretary.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, Anne Longfield, the Children's Commissioner, recently said that she thought that the Prime Minister needs to have a phone call every week with the people that have been charged to deliver this strategy. Has the Prime Minister been having that level of engagement with this strategy?
You wouldn't expect me to know her phone call and diary schedules.
Okay, but I would expect to know on an issue like this the level of engagement there's been from the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary.
The Prime Minister is holding her first ministerial group meeting this afternoon off the back of the summit that was held, I think, 2-3 weeks ago. To discuss with Secretaries of State to discuss the implementation of the summit. Okay,
and the Home Secretary, how often is he leading meetings on this?
I don't have access to his diary, but it is very, very frequently and very regularly.
Weekly?
Well, just to give some context, the Prime Ministerial Task Force meets for the first time this afternoon. The Home Secretary will attend that meeting and will present at that meeting, talking about the threat we face and equally talking about violence reduction units. The Home Secretary chairs the Serious Violence Task Force, which meets roughly once a month, which brings together ministers from across government and strategic partners. He chairs also the Interministerial Group on this. He also chairs regular meetings, I'd say roughly once every 6 weeks, with the Chief Constables most affected. I would say I see the Home Secretary certainly every week, if not twice a week, on this set of issues. This is an area which is a real focus for the Home Secretary and for the Prime Minister. She hosted a summit, including 6 other...
Mr. Greaves, yes. I mean, a lot of this, quite frankly, just sounds like guff, because, I mean, you don't have targets, you don't know any of the statistics, and you're not meeting more than once a month in terms of that direct political oversight.
That's one group, the task force. We also have, as I say, the ministerial group meeting, and we have separate meetings with the chief constables.
Well, it would be...
so these are very busy people with very, very heavy workloads.
I fully understand, but we're talking about children dying.
So every meeting we want it to be an effective meeting. But as I said, we are laying out a schedule, I would say, of activity from the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary down in terms of the engagement we're having with people who are working on the ground.
Okay, well, it doesn't feel good enough. It doesn't feel good enough compared to what some of the leading figures in the sector are requesting. Can I ask one last question about online? We've been taking a lot of evidence in relation to social media companies and what's available online in relation to hate crime and lots of other things. I just did a quick search coming into this committee this morning for what was available in terms of knife violence and certain terms online, just on one provider on YouTube, found video after video after video. Why is that still the case? Why can I find within 2 minutes how to make a prison weapon on YouTube without any restrictions? What do you have to say to the social media companies?
So we have set up the social media hub that we're piloting in London
So what's that doing?
So that is the Metropolitan Police basically working very, very closely with the tech companies to get material, first of all, identified and then offline
how many officers are working on
as
that?
Possible. We have in the region of 40 officers that are working on that in London. The 40? Tech companies are, we have laid out our expectations of them. They are better than they were. We are still not there. I don't pretend that, but that is the reason why the online harms white paper is significant as well, because violent crime is one of the harms that is the focus of that paper.
And why is it that now, not the rights and wrongs of this policy, but why is it that now age verification is being introduced for pornographic content, which I absolutely agree we need to protect young people from, but you can access many videos glorifying violence, knife crime, so on, without any age verification whatsoever?
Well, and we're also, I should say, working with advertisers to ensure that their ads are not inadvertently supporting the websites, not just of serious violence, but also online CSE and terrorism content. With the YouTube, with the drill video, of course, that's not necessarily been classified, and so it's this. We are at the forefront of the internet here with the many difficulties that we have of controlling what goes online. But this is why the social media hub is so important, alongside the online harms white paper, imposing a duty of care on tech companies.
Yeah, and you're absolutely sure that there's 40 officers working on that?
So just to clarify, Mr. Doughty, there are 17 dedicated police officers and staff working in the
Sorry, can you say that again?
17.
17?
Forgive me.
But just to lay this in context...
Full-time working on this?
Yes.
In London?
This is in London because it's a proof of concept in London. But just to be really clear about the layers of our response on this, as the Minister said, we published the online harms white paper. That puts a duty of care on the social media companies themselves. It will establish a regulator who will assess compliance with a published set of standards. There will be a mandatory reporting duty, and there will be strong enforcement powers, including an ability to levy fines. That is something that people who gave evidence to your committee asked for. That is something the government is committed to doing. Equally, colleagues at the Home Office are working in partnership, working very closely with the likes of Google and Facebook. Serious Violence Task Force has challenged them very robustly to increase their investment in training trusted flaggers who bring the attention of the firms to material and get it brought down quickly, and challenging them to improve their response time. I think that partnership is starting to bear fruit, and we are investing in the social media hub within the Metropolitan Police. So that is one part of our overall response to social media.
Mr. Greaves, just to follow up on that last point, Mr. Greaves, you were immediately concerned when the Minister said 40, so you clearly knew it wasn't 40. Is 40?
My apologies.
No, I know, I'm just wondering, is 40 a figure that we should be interested in? For example, that's what was requested, that's what the assessment is needed. You immediately knew it wasn't 40. You weren't sure it was 17, but given the hustle with your officials behind you, immediately knew 40 was an incorrect figure, and I just wondered where that came from.
So as you'll understand, I've had to buff up quite a number of figures, including crime trends, investment figures. So you'll forgive me if I wasn't able to alight on that number. I was thinking it was 15 or 17. Just for reasons of recollection.
Was never a figure, for example, that was requested or an analysis done that was required.
To the best of my knowledge and understanding,
17 is an optimum figure for that department.
This capability came out of direct discussions between colleagues at the Home Office and colleagues in the Metropolitan Police Service and the National Police Chiefs
But
Council.
17 is the right figure. We shouldn't be expecting that there was a request for more or a need for more.
To the best of my knowledge and understanding, there was no request of that sort. This was a proposal that was developed in partnership with the Metropolitan Police Service and the National Police Chiefs Council.
So they asked for 17 specifically?
That is my understanding, and that's what we've given them. That capability will become fully operational at the end of this month. We should look very carefully and early at the impact that it's having and look at opportunities to potentially scale that up, because alongside changes in drugs markets, which we think is a major driver of serious violence, along the increases in vulnerability around exclusions, looked after children and persistently absent, we think that social media has played a part in the recent rises in serious violence. Primarily because it enables disputes, disrespect to escalate very, very quickly. And this is an area we do need a stronger response, and I think we're leaning forward in ways that I've just described.
And it's not just the tech companies, it's the producers behind these drill videos. There are producers who host sites or encourage videos that's, a lot of their business can be, as it were, legitimate, not inciting violence. But they will also, we know from people who we've been speaking to, families in particular who've been affected by this, they will also have videos that are pretty near to the line or over the line when it comes to inciting violence. So I don't think the tech companies are absolutely crucial in this, don't get me wrong, but I think we should also be sending out the message to producers that they need to be taking their responsibilities very seriously as well.
Well, I will just ask then, we had a PCC here a couple of weeks ago who said social media was a problem but didn't realise what the problem was. He said further research had to be done. Do you disagree with that PCC? Mark Williamson, Burns Williamson, said he believed social media was an issue we had to tackle with regard to serious violence, but was totally lost as to what the problem was with social media. Do you think the government's more aware of that than the Police and Complaints Commissioner?
Yeah, we know that YouTube videos are being uploaded,
so why would
particularly for young...
I just wonder, Minister, why would a PCC then be coming to this committee saying he's not aware, and his words I checked earlier on was, we need to speak to the young people to find out more about what the problem is?
So this is a really complex problem. I think Mark, when I read his evidence, was talking about a piece of research which he has commissioned to add to the understanding of the issue. But this is an issue that we've done...
Sorry, just disagree. You don't think anything needs to be added. You think you know the issues.
So they're a very complex set of issues. So as I've said previously, there is good evidence that in a number of cases, particularly in metropolitan areas, that gang violence has escalated, spiraled out of control very quickly, and social media has been a lubricant in that particular dynamic. And so we have good evidence that's the case, and that's why we're leaning into this issue. But it's not a simple issue. I think, as many of the people who gave evidence to your committee suggested, it's quite a challenging issue. So sometimes drill music, there can be violent lyrics, and on the face of it, you can kind of debate, is that inciting violence? For some young people, that's a cultural narrative that's explaining the challenges in their areas in a different context, where there are specific postcodes, names, individuals, or it's uploaded in a certain place. That can be directly inciting violence, and that is why we need to work very closely with young people, with people at St Giles Trust, Red Thread, who really understand this set of issues. And that's why trusted flaggers are so important, because one video could be innocuous in one context and the direct incitement to violence in another. And that's why we need to have those voices flagging that material.
And it doesn't have to be videos. Some gangs have gone into areas that are not their territory and just sort of Snapchatted around to show their rival gang, whose territory they are in, that they're here. And it's very, on first blush, to anyone who doesn't understand the intricacies of that gang rivalry, that may not have any particular significance, but to the kids in those gangs, it's very, very significant, and it can lead to greater animosity. It's not just, I should be fair, it's not just YouTube. We know that other social media sites, Instagram's used. Also, worryingly, some witnesses now are reporting that when they do come forward, that the social media sites are used to try and intimidate them. And that is something that we are trying to work through, how we can help offer reassurance to witnesses who go through that.
Minister, can I ask about the cross-departmental response to this issue? Do you think it's a good thing that it's pan-government, or is there the potential that because no one has one lead authority apart from the Prime Minister, obviously, that it gets lost within the other departments in terms of sometimes if you have too many people dealing with an issue, actually it diminishes the impact the government as a whole can have on it?
Well, I think this issue of knife crime, the causes of knife crime and serious violence there are roots in every single government department that is involved in this strategy and in the broader public health approach. So yesterday, significant that the Secretary of State, when he was giving his statement on the Timpson Review, at the end he talked about the relationship of exclusions and serious violence. In terms of health, the sharing of data from A&E departments is absolutely critical in us understanding where the hotspots are and where we need to tackle it.
In your earlier discussions with the Chair, in answer to the Chair, it was very difficult to pin anything down because, understandably, certain figures and statistics coming from health, education, you can't answer. You can answer the ones from Home Affairs. I'm also worried that there's, too broad a range at government level, and then we go down another level for the local violence reduction units, and we don't know. It could be a chief constable chairing it in one area, someone totally different in the other area. What authority do they have? Is it the same? Is it different? And it just seems a little uncoordinated for something so major.
So at national level, the fact of the Prime Minister's overseeing the meetings that are now taking place today with Secretaries of State, that will then trickle down through the Secretaries of State for their relevant departments. At local level, again, we are conscious
but really it
that
does come down to a crime issue. Crimes are being committed, and the Health Committee may do an inquiry into this, and the Education Committee may do an inquiry into this, but it's more likely to be the Home Affairs Committee that takes the lead on this. And really, then, should it not be the Home Office that takes the lead and does far more than everyone else, and therefore gets the figures from the other departments, rather than saying, well, that's up to the other departments to offer them? This is just my concern, and I could be wrong, and tell me if I am, but I do just think it's going to be too easy to say, well, that's actually an education element of the strategy, that's a health element of the strategy, and it will be too easy to say that's another department's area of responsibility. That's absolutely what we want to avoid, the potential for that to happen. I think the duty of the public health duty will be very significant at local level, because we know that sometimes collaboration between local agencies is it's difficult. It's not as easy as it should be. But at national level, yes, of course, the Home Office will continue to take the lead on law enforcement and what we can do to intervene earlier. But it is also, for example, I think education has a huge role to play in helping ensure that teachers, if they have a concern about a child, that they are feeding that in. We have changed, with the help of DFE, the guidance, safeguarding guidance to teachers and local authorities has changed now to include safeguarding for children who may be involved in gangs, whereas before it tended to be quite centred on the home. We've now put that into the safeguarding practice. And I think the causes of knife crime, as one of the parents who gave evidence said, no child is born with a knife in their hand. There will be things that have happened to them along the road that leads them to be in the situation where they're carrying a knife. And it's not just, I'm conscious we tend to focus on gangs because that tends to be where we see the recruiting and so on by gang leaders. We know also a lot of children are beginning to carry knives because they think that that's how they can protect themselves.
And that's why through work such as #KnifeFree, the national campaign, but also people going into schools or people with lived experience talking to young people about the dangers of carrying a knife, that's where we can make a real difference as well.
Minister, can I ask, the Prime Minister's Summit, do you think that was the right thing for the Prime Minister to do at that time?
Yes, it was. I found it to be a very, very positive summit in that I hosted a round table with business leaders, with faith leaders, with community groups, but also Simon Willove, the racial disparity audit, and young people, asking them if we're trying to divert young people away from criminality, what are the opportunities that we're offering them instead? So you
disagree with Dame Louise Casey, who told this committee when she was discussing the summit, I feel quite cynical, have a summit, have a czar, issue guidance is just a typical response from governments.
I'm afraid I don't agree with it, no. I thought the summit was a really powerful indication of the government's commitment to tackling knife crime, and I think the experiences of the people
So why did it take that summit to show the government's commitment to tackling knife crime? Well, surely the government has had a commitment to tackling knife crime long before that summit.
Yeah, very much so.
And therefore, that's why I was asking specifically about the timing and about everything around the summit. It seems, I can understand why Dame Louise came up with this suggestion, that it just seemed to be an answer to any government's problem, and she did explain this is something that happened in previous governments that she worked for of a different colour. That if you've got a big problem, you host a summit and hope that distracts some of the attention from the issue.
Well, from the summit, as I say, this afternoon the Prime Minister is hosting the first of the Secretaries of State cabinet level ministerial meetings to coordinate
which again, the Prime Minister didn't need a summit to get her cabinet round the table on this issue.
But it was about as much, to me, and it was as much about inviting young people, victims,
but you've got a former Director General of Troubled Families Programme and a former Victims Commissioner who you think we should be trying to encourage with this type of action. And a former Victims Commissioner is very cynical about this idea of just having a summit. Well,
it isn't just a summit, though. That's the point. There's a programme of work. So I don't agree with her, I'm afraid. But it's a programme of work that has come out of the summit. So, for example, I am setting up a forum of big business leaders to challenge them as to what they can do as part of their wider corporate social responsibility to offer opportunities to young people in these areas of the country that we're particularly worried about are being dragged into knife crime.
And finally, Minister, can I ask, the serious violence strategy, does it contain the answer to all the issues in here?
To me, it is a document that evolves. There are, as we are working on the Serious Violence Task Force, there are issues coming to light that we are then working on. And so, to me, it is the foundations. But, crikey, we are open to any ideas and suggestions. We are all determined to work together to solve this. And I think as we look at the programme of work going forward, for example, the consultation on the public health duty, for example, the £200 million Youth Endowment Fund, for example, the independent review on drugs, the strategy was very much our foundation, but of course we're building on that.
Mr. Greaves.
So we published in the strategy a detailed description of the trends and drivers. Actually, that's quite a strong account, and that is the foundation stone on which we've built our strategy. That will evolve over time as trends change. That will evolve as our assessment and a detailed analysis evolves. We set out a strong framework of activity, and we've made real strong progress early with the Offensive Weapons Bill, #KnifeFree, £22 million of Early Intervention Youth Fund money. But equally, we have developed and stepped up action over time. So at the Conservative Party conference, the Home Secretary announced an independent review of drugs because of the role that drugs is playing in the market and concerns he had around links to serious violence. The consultation on the new legal duty, and also the investment in the £200 million youth endowment fund to really build the evidence base of what works and invest in proven interventions. Equally invested a further £100 million to support kind of surge policing and the creation of the VRU. So we are building up a response, and I think the PM Summit and the first meeting of the PM implementation task force is a really important moment, actually getting the whole of government together and really making sure we've got a really shared, deep understanding of the problem we're trying to solve, the risk and protective factors, and really developing a next phase of the programme planning around that. So it will evolve as the problem evolves.
And a good example of that are knife crime prevention orders. The police asked us to introduce these. They asked us, I think, at the end of summer last year, and so we have put them as a pilot into the Offensive Weapons Bill, which is about to receive royal assent, because the police have said to us, look, these children who we suspect, we have intelligence that they are carrying knives, they haven't yet been caught, and we want to try and intervene before they either do great harm with those knives or they end up in a youth court because they've been found in possession of one. And so these prevention orders are an example of us listening, us evolving and reacting to the requests of those who are on the ground working with these children, trying to solve these crimes, trying to prevent it from happening in the first place, in a way that we can do on a national level.
Thank you.
Kate Green.
Thank you. You've spoken of the additional £100 million that was provided really on an emergency basis, but that's against the backdrop, isn't it, of £3 billion of cuts in real terms to police since 2010. Do you think that the police are adequately funded to deal with the knife crime challenge?
Well, look, I mean, I don't want to go into a history lesson. I mean, we inherited a very, very bad economic picture in 2010. We had to make some very difficult decisions. We got to a stage in 2015 where the then Home Secretary was able to protect police spending. We are now in a situation where we're able to spend more on policing. And this is why we have more than £1 billion in addition to what was added last year. I mean, we are very conscious, and the Home Secretary has been very clear, that the challenges facing the police are different from how perhaps they were 5-10 years ago, and that police spending is his priority going into the next spending round. I mean, if you look at some of the crimes that we are very, very conscious of today that perhaps they were there, but they weren't reported or they weren't investigated in the same way that they are nowadays, such as modern slavery, such as child sexual exploitation, including historic allegations. These are incredibly complex investigations, which of course require huge amounts in terms of police expertise and resources.
Of course they do, but
and
does
so
that
this
mean
is
there's
why
not
it's
enough
overall
funding left for the on-the-street policing that witnesses to this committee have suggested, the neighbourhood policing that witnesses to this committee have suggested is important in tackling serious violence and knife crime?
Well, we listened to police and crime commissioners, we listened to chief constables, and it was as a result of meetings with the chiefs, but also the Serious Violence Task Force, that the extra £100 million was announced in the spring statement.
And is that to put more police on the streets?
It's to help with what the police call surge policing. So already with the funding formula that was passed by the House a couple of months ago, with the £970 million, most, in fact, I think pretty much all, but perhaps one, PCC has committed to using the increase in funding that they're going to receive to recruit more police officers and police staff. It's in the region of 3,500 at the moment that they're talking about, and so that is in addition to the £100 million which we've already talked about is being given to help with overtime.
So police numbers are important in bringing down serious violence and knife crime. Would that be a correct conclusion to draw from what you've just said? I
think, of course police numbers are important when we're looking at how we tackle crime in this country. I mean, no government of any colour has been able to come up with the magic formula of this number of police officers and this number of funding will lead to this reduction in violence. I mean, that would be, if any countries discovered that, then that would be something that I'm sure any government of any colour would seize on. And the reason I cite this is because when we look at the last time there was a spike in serious violence in the early to mid 2000s, police numbers then were far higher and they were rising. So this is why we've been at pains in the serious violence strategy to say, look, there are many, many, many reasons and factors behind the increase in serious violence. And I think most academics, I don't think I'm misquoted, with significant increases in crime, it doesn't tend to be as a result of what is happening in policing. I think that's, am I describing that correctly?
I think that's right. Generally, significant shifts in crime trends are primarily driven by external factors. If
violent
you look at
crime is obviously what we're particularly interested in.
Absolutely, and both acquisitive and violent crimes. If you look at acquisitive crime in the 80s and 90s, the heroin epidemic of the 80s and 90s was a major factor in the upward trend. In the downward trend, two of the major drivers were actually vehicle immobilisers and improved home safety. In the case of serious violence, it's much more complicated than significant reductions in outputs, both as you, Mr. Doughty, have said, because the Minister said in early to mid-2000s we saw near record levels of police resources and police numbers, and they were rising, and yet we saw a spike of crime. It's more complicated than that. It's actually what you do with those boots on the ground. Efficiency, productivity, tooling are really, really important. Equally, what you do with those officers. The evidence suggests that hotspot policing and problem-solving policing are what works, and we'll be working very closely with HMI CFRS to make sure that police and other partners are following the evidence. But it's not even just about law enforcement, what it does with those resources. It's about a much wider set of social drivers. Changes in drugs markets. We've seen increased availability of drugs, increased purity of drugs, and drugs gangs taking the opportunity to establish the county lines methodology with violence and exploitation at its heart. We think that's a major driver. We've talked about social media. We think that's a driver. We think that the increases in vulnerable population may also have been a factor. So you need to look at a much wider, complex set of factors rather than draw a direct line between inputs and outcomes in this area.
I understand that, but within that mix, many of our witnesses have suggested that neighbourhood policing is important, not least because that is the way in which the police build trust and confidence with young people in their communities. Do you think that's right? And if you do think it's right, do you think that neighbourhood policing is adequately resourced, given that that has seen an average 35% cut in the last few years?
Well, of course, neighbourhood policing is important, and in that I include PCSOs. But and it's why, frankly, if local police and crime commissioners think that the best way to spend the money they're receiving is on extra officers, we absolutely welcome that. I mean, I do take the opportunity just to draw to people's attentions the fact that police forces have reserves, and there is a wide range of reserves for different forces. And my encouragement to chiefs and to police and crime commissioners is, yes, of course you've got to keep a buffer, as it were, for emergencies, but if the taxpayer's giving you money to spend on policing, please spend it, because we've seen some of our forces have very, very large reserves, and it's difficult to understand that.
Do those forces matched where we're seeing these increases in violent crime?
So I can give you, if you'll forgive me, I'll just find, if we look at...
Well, the Minister finds that number. If I can just come back on your point about community engagement, I think the evidence suggests that as well as kind of targeted, kind of visible deterrence, meaningful community engagement is important, both to build trust in communities and to garner community intelligence. That's the evidence which kind of underpins the long-term downward trend in New York, for example. That was a mixture of data-led policing, visible patrols, and strong community engagement.
And do you consider you're adequately resourced for that, or the police are adequately resourced for that strong community engagement? It's certainly what I hear in my own constituency, that there aren't enough police around for those relationships, that trust building, those connections between our local young people and local police to take place in the way that the community feel is needed?
So the £100 million I talked about, 65 million of which will be in surge policing, will be used in a wide range of ways as driven and determined by the Chief Constable locally. That may be on equipment, that may be on patrols, weapon sweeps, but actually some of that can be around kind of strong community engagement, working with neighbourhood teams, equally working in partnerships with schools. And
will the Home Office be assessing what mix works best? Will you be looking at outcomes on those different mixes and models?
We will be looking very closely both at activity and outcomes, and looking to draw insights from that to generate a kind of an evaluation of the work. Clearly that would take a degree of time, but we'll be maintaining a close dialogue with the chiefs concerned.
Just to help you, and I emphasise that this is of March 2018, so it may well be the figures have come down, but the reserves of Greater Manchester was 75.6 million.
Yes, but the pressures on Greater Manchester Police, I can tell you as a Greater Manchester MP, not least in tackling terrorism and keeping our community safe, are very, very substantial. And indeed, the pensions bill alone for Greater Manchester Police, I think I'm right in saying, is something over 100 million.
Increased by 25 million since 2011. So my plea, as I say, please spend that money, is my answer.
Okay.
Which I'm sure they are doing that.
How about the importance of officers in schools? Does the Home Office have a view on how valuable schools-based officers are?
So that will be that's a local decision, an operational matter for police chiefs and PCCs.
Does it trouble you that the West Midlands Chief Constable told us that he didn't think he had the resources to put any officers in schools or pupil referral units at all?
Well, I mean, Dan may be able to. Again, I mean, that would be an operational matter for the
I don't think
chief.
He was saying he didn't want to. He was simply saying he had not got the resources to place police officers in pupil referral units.
Just to reassure you that as the second largest force and the second largest by knife crime volumes, the West Midlands will be a significant recipient of the Serious Violence Fund. Of the 65 million, 7,600,000 will be going to the West Midlands Police. And I think there will be a dialogue between us as they submit their plan, as Minister Hurd has requested. That will be a challenge that we will make from the Home Office to make sure the balance of investment is correct, from enforcement through to community engagement.
Does the Home Office know how many school-based police officers there are now, say, with 10 years ago?
That will be information held at a local level. I mean, again, we're very conscious that there are different responses in different parts of the country. So, for example, Operation Sceptre, which is the week of national activity that the police forces hold every 6 months, and it's not, it is not the week of the only weeks that the police will be working on knife crime, but it's used as a big set piece exercise, and you'll all have I'm sure been aware of it when it happened earlier this year. The range of ways in which the police choose to mark Operation Sceptre Week is various. I mean, there will be school visits, and more than 1,000, I think, school visits have been reported to us for September 2018's last week. But there will also be knife searches, there will be knife amnesties, there will be weapon sweeps and so on. There's a range of ways in which the police can do this. And I as a minister, as the Home Office, we do have to tread that very fine line about not telling chief constables how to run operational matters.
But you will want to look, I'm sure, across all forces at what has been effective and how money has made the greatest difference in particular approaches. Will you undertake, therefore, that it will be the role of the Home Office to make that assessment, to gather that evidence and consider it, and to use that to inform the way in which you prepare the department's case for a long-term funding settlement for the police?
So I think you rightly identified it. It's not just about the presence in a particular school, it's about doing what works. Yeah. And the evidence suggests that there are some techniques, some of which are still being done, around kind of scared straight, which can be ineffective. I think that's something your committee was told during the evidence session. So one of the 61 commitments in the serious violence strategy is to prepare guidance jointly with the education sector and police, drawing out the evidence of what works and what's the most optimal use of those school-based partnerships.
And there can be there can be a range of ways in which the police meet young people. I visited Blackpool very recently, which is it is suffering from county lines at the moment, and I met several young police cadets there who the officer in charge of the cadets said to me, you know, we're really pleased that we've been able to include them because we couldn't be sure that one or two of them may not have gone down the wrong path. So there are different ways that the police can reach children. It doesn't just have to be through school, important though that can be.
So my assessment is that if the Home Office is to be, as you, I think, have said as a department, you intend to be forward-leaning in your approach to working with police forces on violent crime, that should put on the Home Office a responsibility to draw together that knowledge and information and to use that to spread best practice and to ensure that best practice is adequately and appropriately funded. Would that be fair?
Yes, it is, and and we disseminate that knowledge through not just through the Serious Violence Task Force and meetings with chief constables, but also with the workings that officials have with police forces across the country.
One last question from me, which is not directly a Home Officer's responsibility, but I'm interested in your perception. We've seen a toughening of sentencing for knife crime in recent years. What assessment is the government making of the effectiveness of tougher sentences for carrying and using knives?
Well, the purpose of we have the mandatory minimum sentence for the second strike of carrying knives, and the reason that was introduced was very much to send out the message that as to the importance, you know, how serious it is if you are caught carrying a knife. I should say not just on the second occasion. You know, people sometimes we don't always remember that, of course, if you are in possession of a knife first time, then there is a maximum sentence available to adults of 4 years. So it's a discretion of the judge.
As to how that's shaping behaviour?
Yeah, so we know that the average length of custodial sentences for knife and offensive weapons offences has increased from 5.3 months in 2008 to 8.1 months in 2018, and we know that that 37% of knife and offensive weapons offences resulted in an immediate custodial sentence in 2018 compared with 20%
But I wasn't actually asking about
2008.
sentencers' behaviour. I was interested in whether it was actually serving as a deterrent, a discouragement to knife crime.
So we set out evidence in the Modern Crime Prevention Strategy, which was published, I think, in 2017, which looked at the drivers of crime, which include drugs, alcohol, opportunity, character, and so forth. The effectiveness of the criminal justice system we set out in some detail our assessment of the evidence. I think the strongest evidence relates to the certainty of being brought to justice and being given a sanction. There's a weaker correlation in the evidence between the severity of a sentence and the deterrent effect. Although, of course, imprisonment and incarceration does provide an opportunity to intervene in a rehabilitative way and in an incapacitative way with an offender.
Just to follow up, the guidance that you referred to on policing and schools cooperation, when will that be produced?
I'll have to come back to you, Chair, on that detail. I know it's not yet. I know it's in gestation, and I know it will be published shortly, but I don't know the precise date. But I'd be happy to come back to you with an estimated time frame for delivery.
And can I just clarify, is it the Home Office's position that you do not have a view on whether or not police officers should be based in schools and whether that's a good thing? I understand it's the final decision is always one for operational police officers, but I don't understand do you think it is a good thing or not? You think that neighbourhood policing is a good thing, but it's for them to make a final decision on how many. Do you think that having police officers based in schools is a good thing?
Well, I think it also depends on the school, because as we know from hotspot policing, there will be some schools where this is a live, daily, it's a daily issue. There will be other schools across the country where it isn't, and I think it's about in the right schools. It would be. I would hope that there would be a police relationship established, but again, it has to be at local level. I think.
Okay. John Woodcock.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for having missed the very opening of the session. We focused on the very significant rise in knife crime. You've also, by the government's own figures, you've had a close to trebling of the number of county lines in operation within 2 years. I thought, Mr. Greaves, you spoke. You gave a good account of the many and complex drivers, and then therefore the complexity of the levers which any government can operate in order to change, to turn the situation around. But do you accept, Minister, that the totality of the levers and the way that they are resourced are just not sufficient to turn this round at the moment?
We have, and I'm very cautious about this, but the figures that were released for the year ending December 2018 were, they showed the increases, but the work that has been going on in London in terms of immediate law enforcement suggests signs of a slowing in the rate of, for example, injuries in under 25. So yeah. I don't think this is out of our reach at all, but I think we are right to keep examining whether we are putting the correct resources into the right
out of your reach to stop the level of increase. The reason I push you is I understand that often these sessions become quite inquisitorial, and that I think leads you and ministers into a defensive approach on this. But I think most people looking at this from the outside, when they see the scale of the problem, they may accept that a public health approach is indeed right, but they see the scale of the reductions in expenditure across so much of that public realm, for which a public health approach would be required, and they just cannot see it as being realistic to reduce significantly the levels of violent crime that have resulted in that.
Can I just respond to a couple of your points, if I can? We talked about the number of county lines and that having increased. I think law enforcement colleagues at the National Crime Agency and the National Police Chiefs Council would say, actually, it's not necessarily the case that the number has increased. It's just their understanding. They've developed an understanding.
Okay. I want to avoid. I take that point.
It's not a serious problem. It's a very serious problem.
I take that point, but. If I can just pause you for a moment, I take that point, but I think it's very easy in these sessions to get into the detail of this when we know there is by whatever measure, really, there is a significantly increased problem in violent crime and the things associated with it. And I think part of the frustration you see on this committee is that look, I think you are a dedicated minister and the government wants to do something about this, but you aren't prepared to be quite as open as perhaps you could be, that what is on the table at the moment is simply not sufficient to turn this round in the way that you would like. Isn't that fair?
The Home Secretary's made it clear that from a policing perspective, the policing will be his priority in the spending review. Yeah. I think we need to get out of the traditional Treasury Whitehall way of looking at these massive societal issues as being so siloed. There are a number of areas of my portfolio where I am reaching out, and we ministers across departments are working together, because I appreciate that if the police arrest somebody for a particular type of exploitative offence, not just serious violence, but they will end up in the criminal justice system, they may end up in the prison population as well. So to me it is about resources, but it's also about looking at it across.
Indeed.
As
no, absolutely, very much so, absolutely. However, that would imply that with a greater degree of working together, and you've been really pushed on, how often are you meeting, how our ministers work together, that would imply that with a greater level of working together, the system could crack this without a level of increase in resource or simply restoration of resource taken away. which is simply not on the table. And you, of all ministers, I think, are probably in a place to actually to call that as it is. And without calling it as it is, we are never going to hope to get on top of the problem, because we're always going to be discussing is how is this 100 million being spent? Isn't this a great thing? Are we slowing? Whereas actually the level of resource is just not close to being enough to really properly get this under control.
This is why the spending review is so important.
So make the case publicly now, Minister.
We are at the end of a spending review period, and there is a huge amount of work going on, not just in the context of serious violence, because the committee understands full well.
So dial down the diplomatic language for a moment, Minister, and make the case.
There is work going on with the spending review. I would like us to be quite bold in the way we approach issues such as adverse childhood experiences. The committee may know that the Leader of the Commons is leading a group of ministers that is looking at the first 2 years of development. I elbowed my way onto that committee because although the Home Office doesn't have responsibility for early years care, too often the domestic abuse, the neglect or the adverse childhood experiences that happen in the first 2 years we then end up dealing with later on.
And that's yet another factor, and it's helpful to raise. Presumably it will be a problem in tackling this area if the rumours do turn out to be true and the 3-year spending review becomes a 1-year spending review. Well, it's not helpful. It's either helpful or it's not, and you can say.
I hope that I think a lot of the organisations we're working with, particularly the charitable sector, the longer we can give them in terms of funding, the longer periods of time we can. Of course, it helps them because they're then concentrating on their work rather than funding.
Do you accept there is a pressure and potentially a deficiency in the system between the amount of autonomy which the various parts of the public realm have, and you have, if I was being uncharitable, I would say taken refuge sometimes in saying, oh well, that's a matter for the police, that's a matter for local authorities. But if central government, either from the Prime Minister, from the Home Office downwards, cannot have greater power to direct funding that goes into health, that goes into education, that goes into local authorities to provide activities for young people, that goes into local forces, unless you have greater powers to channel that money, then even if you get the increase in resources, they aren't going to be able to properly tackle the problem. That's a concern, isn't it?
I think there's been... there's been a huge change in approach between, and I'm not being party political here, but the previous administration was tended to be quite centralised, and the coalition government was very keen on taking power to local areas through, for example, the election of police and crime commissioners, and so it means that when we make funding decisions, as it's on a national level, it's then for local police and crime commissioners, for example, to decide how they spend that money locally, and we say, well,
but that's a problem if you are a minister who is being held to account for the huge rise in violence crime, and you no longer have the levers that you need to pull. It's gone too far in the wrong direction.
Well, a good police and crime commissioner can make an extraordinary difference in their local area.
Sure.
Whether or not they sit here and give evidence, I don't know. But
finally, Minister, on another subject, the use of rape as a weapon of serious violence, it sends a deeply alarming message to many people around the country if they were to see someone who put themselves in the political sphere being able to essentially incite rape or make jokes about rape to another person in the public eye. It's deeply distressing, isn't it? And what can you do about it?
It's disgraceful. and my sympathies and thoughts are with our colleague, our friend, who's having to deal with this. I'm afraid, we know that many female MPs and many women in the wider public eye receive threats of rape and death online and in emails. I just don't know what's happened to public discourse in this country that people think it's okay to speak like that. Whatever decision, well, obviously I can't comment on individual operational decisions, but any colleague who receives that sort of abuse online, I hope has all of our support, and the work that we're trying to do through the Prime Minister announced last year work on tackling offences of abuse of elected officials and so on. That is really important and must continue.
Thank you, because it's not just that Jess Phillips is being threatened in the street now, but there's reports this morning that female journalists who report on this are now getting directly. But does this give you cause? And I'm not expecting an announcement now, but does this give you a sense that you feel you might need to relook at the current framework over incitement, given that something can explode in this way and cause serious threats to people's well-being?
As I say, the Prime Minister announced the intention to look at this. Indeed, that's going on. I will write to you with more details on this. But as I say, any person in the public eye, regardless of whether they're a member of Parliament or celebrity or a journalist, it's just not a decent way to behave. And this goes back to public discourse more widely on social media and about, I suppose, teaching our children that it's not okay to say these things. What's illegal offline is illegal online.
Because if a politician can say this in the public eye to another public politician and escape any kind of credible punishment for that, then what does it say to people who are not in the public eye and what they can do outside of that?
Well, I mustn't be drawn into discussing the individual case because, as I say, I'm conscious there's an operation going on. But it's for everyone casting their vote to decide whether the way in which they're casting their vote is in line with their overall view of the world, their ethics, their understanding of common decency, I think.
And I think your concern, obviously, I think would be shared by everybody on this. It would also, I think, be helpful if you were able to write, or if another Home Office Minister was able to write to us on this. I'm sure, too, you would agree that political parties have a responsibility to make much stronger action in these sorts of circumstances, and notwithstanding the individual criminal investigation that's underway, it would be very helpful to know whether you are looking again at the electoral framework and the consequences when issues around incitement to violence and these kinds of issues are raised.
The Home Secretary has taken a personal interest in this. I don't know what more I can say at this stage, but he's taken a personal interest in this overall issue. I'm careful to emphasise.
Can I just quickly ask you then just some follow-up, just factual questions? Just going back to the issue about the funding for different organisations, different youth investments and so on. You've got your Youth Endowment Fund, we've got a CLG Youth Deterrent Fund, you've got Trusted Relationships Fund and so on. Anne Longfield did raise concern about that these were very fragmented interventions. It'd be very helpful to have an assessment from you about how much from all of these different funds will be spent on these interventions this year. So obviously your endowment fund is spread over 20 years, over 10 years. My calculation from it is it looks like in total all of these add up to about 35 million. in a year for this coming year, compared to about 700 million that's been cut from youth services. Now, it would be useful to have an accurate figure from you about the annual funding you are putting in.
Of course,
from
I'll
these
provide
programmes.
that because there are other sources of funding as well. I would make the point about the £200 million Youth Endowment Fund. That's been created in such a way that it will be invested as well, so that the £200 million is increased. It's leveraged up over 10 years. So, but that's a detail.
It would be useful to know. Is it 20 million this coming year? Is it nothing this year and money next
Very
year?
happy to.
You could just do with use of the funding precisely. Yeah. Then you also referred to a meeting this afternoon. Which one was that?
It is the Prime Minister's, let me get the full title, it is arising out of the summit. It is the Serious Violence Strategy Implementation Task Force.
Okay, it would be really helpful if you could go along to that meeting and ask for some of the basic information that we've been asking for. So to ask how many young people are thought to be at risk of getting drawn into carrying a knife, how many areas you identify as being high-risk areas, how many young people live in high-risk areas and therefore might be at risk, how many young people are currently being reached by any form of youth prevention work, how many young people are going to be reached as a result of the programmes that you have talked about. How many police officers do you have in schools across the country at the moment? And also, who is in charge in each area, or at least who is in charge in each of the areas where knife crime is rising significantly and you believe that there is a problem and that more action is needed? And if you could also set out your expectations of when you want the person in each of those areas to report back to the Prime Minister's task force, so that we can have some confidence that some action is actually being taken. You've got a grip on the scale of the problem, the Home Office is taking some follow-up action, and that people are actually going to be held to account. You will, I think, have understood our concern. This is not just about our job in terms of the scrutiny role that we play. This is also about the children's lives who are being lost, the young people's lives who are being lost, and the ever-increasing number of knife crimes that are happening across this country. We have heard too much evidence in the course of this inquiry that suggests that the government does not have a grip. And you just haven't given me the reassurance in the course of this evidence that they're wrong and you're right, and that you do actually have a grip of this. And this is just too serious for any of us to let this drift. Thank you very much for your evidence today. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.